Welcome to the Policy Center Live. I'm your host, Tanya Gray. The purpose of our podcast is to educate farmers and ranchers, agricultural professionals, and the general public on agricultural research and policies impacting farmers and their communities. Each show will focus on an area of agricultural policies and its impact on farmers. We hope you enjoy the show. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Muhammed, Professor and Blasingame Chair of Excellence in Agricultural Policy for the University of Tennessee Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics. He brings considerable experience and research to the Blasingame Chair position, where he focuses on assisting stakeholders in the evaluation of opportunities, policies, and programs on international trade. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Muhammed.
Oh, thank you for having me, Tanya.
So given today's agricultural climate, where global markets, trade agreements, and policy shifts are influencing farmers, ranchers, and consumers alike, your perspective is especially valuable. To begin, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the current state of international agricultural trade and how it's impacting farmers and ranchers here at home, given the crisis that farmers are experiencing.
Yeah, no, thank you. I guess I'll start with just some background on the importance of international trade to U.S. agriculture. One thing to note is that on average, we export about 20% of what we produce. That could range from as high as 75 to 80% for U.S. cotton production. It's around 10%. Say for animal products like U.S. beef production, but to put that in context, that's about $10 billion of U.S. beef exports, each year, making beef, say, a top 5 export. And so the point I want to just simply sort of start with is the importance of global markets for U.S. production and the disappearance of U.S. supply. Now, to be certain, we do consume quite a bit, but most of our row crop production, and particularly like soybeans, wheat, a big part of that is for global markets. And unfortunately, so much of that was going to the Chinese market, and as well as other markets. And we've increased these trade tensions with these major destinations. And during the previous Trump administration, that the last trade war in 2018, one of the things that we saw then was retaliation by many of the countries that we targeted in terms of tariffs. And that retaliation was directly targeted against U.S. agriculture, and we saw significant declines. Now, this time around, which we would say sort of Trump tariffs or trade war 2.0, countries have been much more muted in their retaliation. But there's something about the way in which the president has implemented these policies. And that's the uncertainty associated with it. And the uncertainty has actually led to countries even more so sort of stepping away from the U.S. as a major supplier and then seeking other markets. And so, for example, if we take China, which prior to the previous trade war and up until a couple of years ago was our leading destination for U.S. agricultural exports, China has now dropped to our third leading market and dropped quite significantly to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. But what's happened as a result is it's not that the Chinese have decreased what they import. The Chinese are continuing to import agricultural products. In fact, they're importing more agricultural products, but are becoming less and less reliant on the U.S. as a major supplier, leading to significant increases in, say, beef exports from Brazil, corn exports from Brazil, cotton exports from Brazil, and other South American countries. And so the point is that what's taking place now is, or sort of these protectionist type trade policies are making it particularly difficult for countries to do businesses with American farmers and for American farmers to do business with these destination markets.
What policies do you see as most critical for U.S. farmers to remain competitive internationally?
One of the things clearly would be issues related to the tariffs. Now, the one thing we have to be clear on is the tariffs we impose on imports do not necessarily lead to any type of retaliation on exports. So it's usually the direct retaliation. But here's the thing, I think, what our trade policy has done, and I'll sort of reiterate this. What our trade policy has done is created tensions between sort of partner countries as well as uncertainty. And here's what I mean by uncertainty. All right, so you can imagine, and just to sort of step outside of agriculture for a second, you can imagine a U.S. investor, and that U.S. investor is thinking about expanding capacity in a foreign country or expanding capacity domestically. And what this uncertainty does is it causes that investor to simply park his or her money on the sideline, right? There's no reason to invest in domestic capacity because you don't know if the tariffs are temporary. But there's no reason to invest in foreign capacity either because you don't know if the tariffs are permanent. And so the point is, what this has done is sort of cause sort of investors to park money on the sideline. But from the perspective of the importing country, that if the U.S. is not a reliable partner, and by reliable, I simply mean this, that when businesses engage in transactions, they need to know that there's a certain permanence in the business environment that they're operating in. And so what they don't want is to engage in a contract this time, this year, and 6 months down the road, there's some tariff that needs to be paid, or there's some trade policy that needs to be addressed. And so the point is, this uncertainty simply causes importing countries and firms in importing countries just to seek out alternative markets where the trade policy environment is more stable. And so just to sort of reiterate, so it's not simply the tariffs in and of themselves represent barriers, but it's the sort of the way in which the policy is being implemented leading to this uncertainty that's also particularly problematic.
What role do non-tariff barriers like food safety regulations, environmental standards, or labor policies play in shaping trade opportunities?
Well, no, that's actually a real good question, and I think part of what is often argued by the White House is that these tariffs could be used as leverage to improve the regulatory infrastructure such that destination markets would have regulatory policies more favorable to U.S. agricultural products. And so the big one, for example, for the United States in terms of beef, let's say, would be the ban on hormone treated beef in European markets, right? That most of the beef that we produce is produced with the assistance of growth hormones. Hormone treated beef is for the most part banned. And obviously, the US and Europe are engaged in some tensions to where we believe our production methods are sound and actually are not harmful to human health, whereas the Europeans are claiming otherwise, despite the fact that just sort of global science does not in any way sort of support what the EU is necessarily saying about hormone treated beef. The point is that I think these tariffs have been used to engage in some leverage in this way to help regulatory policies. But for example, I don't recall when we finally came to some agreement with Europe if hormone treated beef was all of a sudden 100% allowed, despite the fact that we did get some regulatory changes that would sort of help meat exports to the European market. Now, other issues tend to be sort of genetically modified crops, and that's also in the case as it relates to European markets more so than other markets. But for the most part, the regulatory hurdles that we often face globally is mostly about the science, right? There are some licensing issues that we deal with, and then clearly, as we sort of come out of animal disease bans, say for example, avian influenza, as it relates to U.S. chicken and poultry exports, as it relates to mad cow disease and BSE bans from decades prior, as it relates to U.S. beef exports, where countries have sort of imposed restrictions, such as, say, the age limit on cattle being slaughtered for export sales. Often that gets relaxed through some of these back and forth trade negotiations. But yes, I mean, regulatory barriers tend to be sort of important. Another important regulatory barrier is the harmonization of standards. Right. So, for example, what we consider organic may not be exactly how organic products are defined in a foreign market, and we often have to come to some type of agreement to say, even though we define these slightly different, we're going to impose standards that allow for your organic standards to still sort of maintain a label in our country, and we'll do the same for your country in the United States. So you get all types of sort of non-tariff barriers affecting trade. And so, yes, I think one of the upsides to sort of entering into negotiations with countries is you do get a harmonization of standards and regulatory policies.
What are the most promising international markets for U.S. agricultural products right now?
That's the downside of what's sort of taking place now, right? Is that when you create such tensions, not only do you affect existing markets and well-established markets, but you also affect sort of these new markets that could possibly emerge. And so there are quite a few markets, depending on how one thinks about the future of U.S. agricultural export sales, and as well as sort of the infrastructure in place allowing for the facilitation of international trade, both in the short and long run. And so one could just simply think of the sheer size of the market where we would still want to maintain a major share of the Chinese market, which seems to clearly have been negatively impacted both by the previous trade war as well as current trade tensions. One could think about the growing population in India, also sort of the largest country in the world, where demand can clearly be ramped up such that it leads to increases in export sales. There's clearly the North African market, as well as the Middle East. And then obviously I have a personal interest in developing export sales to the sub-Saharan African region, where we're seeing huge economic growth. One could argue that South America is also emerging, given economic development there. And I think what's key here is for the U.S. to start early, particularly in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where they're actually sort of right on the cusp of the development spectrum and increasing in terms of income and in the overall economy. And here's the thing to note about growing emerging markets, very different from well-established markets like the United States. And that is that the amount of additional income spent on food is much larger in the developing world versus industrialized countries like the United States. So even if my income, for example, increases by $1, my expenditures on food may actually change very little, or it may not change at all. Whereas in the developing world, particularly in the poorest countries in the world, $1 increase in income will often lead to a 60-cent increase in food spending. And so not only do we see sort of the developing world as a major a potential destination moving forward, it is where the increase in food demand will take place beyond the capacity of these countries to produce it. And they've already have established relationships with China, Europe as a former colonizer. And I think with the U.S. engaged in this type of trade policy, it could make it difficult for the U.S. to gain inroads in many of these emerging markets.
If you could recommend one policy reform to improve the U.S. position in global agricultural trade, what would it be?
That's actually sort of a tougher question than one would think, because all countries engage in some level of protection for their agricultural sectors. And in fact, trade protection in agriculture has been probably one of the longest standing type sectors where protection has been allowed, because it was established decades ago, even going back to the formation of the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, that agriculture was vital to a country's national security. And as a result of that, it was understandable that countries would engage in domestic support through sort of government subsidies as well as trade protections to maintain a viable agricultural sector. All right, and so what that means is that it wasn't until the Uruguay round, which I think was in the early 1990s, which culminated in the World Trade Organization, which replaced the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, that we got what was called the Agreement on Agriculture, where countries like the US and countries like Europe decided to decrease restrictions on agricultural trade. The point is, many countries still have tariffs in place. And so what we first need, and we were still negotiating these type of agreements, is improved market access in many countries, both developed and developing countries, where we agree as well as those countries agree to decrease tariffs on the products that they import. And what's unfortunate is that in, say, for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is an agreement President Trump withdrew from during his first term, you get 11 countries agreeing to decrease tariffs. But we don't have, say, an agreement with Vietnam, which is a major destination market for many U.S. agricultural products. We only have a bilateral agreement with Japan, separate and outside of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so what we have are just sort of these either existing tariffs still in place that we should probably negotiate to much lower tariffs, if not zero tariffs. And what we also have are countries that we compete with existing trade agreements where they're actually facing relatively lower tariffs. So first and foremost, I think tariffs are still key, and not the erection of tariffs, but the decreasing of tariffs. The other thing, as we already mentioned, is that we still do need to get sort of regulatory policies in order. One could argue that we need to come to some type of harmonization on European regulatory policy such that it favors U.S. exports. And what's key here is clearly, can we come to some agreement that's both science-based and sound, as well as an agreement that's both palatable for European importers and consumers, but beneficial for U.S. exporters.
On the heels of talking about tariffs, Dr. Muhammad, there was an article published by Talk Business Politics, and I think it was a couple of weeks ago, and it was titled Arkansas on the Verge of Agricultural Disaster. But in that article, it spoke about $100 billion collected in tariffs, and the farmers would love to see some of that tariff money to help supplement their income. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have some mixed feelings. Obviously, if agricultural producers are suffering as a result of current trade policies, and these current trade policies sort of have come out of the blue, and so they're not factored into production decisions, one could argue for a certain amount of compensation and in support for farmers and any producer sort of suffering as a result of sort of the current policies. Well, at the same time, this sort of sends the wrong signals, right? Because one would argue we would prefer a world with more consistent trade policy, and farmers are then allowed to sort of make sound economic decisions in a more stable context, in a more stable policy environment. But this new world of sort of increasing uncertainty on and off again tariffs, and then compensation as a result of these on again and off again tariffs, it almost strikes me as like political payoffs and political hush money, right? Just this overall goal to say, we know these policies do not work in your favor, but if we give you cash instead, will you not sort of speak out against these policies not working in your favor? And I would be much more inclined to encourage the agricultural sector, to encourage Washington and those who sort of hold the levers of policy to create a much more stable environment for better production decisions, as opposed to an unstable environment. But then we seek compensation to not speak out.
How can small and mid-sized farmers best position themselves to benefit from international trade opportunities? I think a lot of times we talk about large row crop farmers and them growing soybeans and rice and corn, but how can small and mid-sized farmers benefit as well?
The one thing about small and mid-sized farmers is sort of the capacity um, to engage the global arena. Right now, one of the good things about the U.S. Department of Agriculture is that the USDA has an infrastructure in place for export promotion activities. And those export promotion activities, to a certain degree, actually benefit small scale and medium scale producers. A big part of that is through the market access program, and a lot of that money comes through the Southern U.S. Trade Association. And what they actually do is provide sort of cost share programs for small scale producers to at least engage global markets through trade shows and through other trade promotion activities. And so, what I would say to any small scale producer or medium scale producer interested in engaging global markets along with the larger scale producers is to really plug into USDA programs dedicated to export promotion activities. Because obviously, being on such a small scale, it's very difficult as an individual firm to sort of establish business to business relationships across oceans, right? So, international business and global business does require a certain infrastructure and consistency. And I think USDA has been quite good in their grant programs and promotion programs and funding programs dedicated to making these global connections.
In your opinion, what role should U.S. agricultural policy play in strengthening food security?
The two things you want to sort of think about here is global food security, um, domestic food security, and then the livelihoods of farmers both domestically and around the world. And there is no clear solution in sort of balancing all of this. Right. So if one simply thinks about improving global food security, right? This idea of producing enough healthy food to feed a growing global population while at the same time preserving environmental quality, global biodiversity, um, and sort of providing then nutritious and healthy food in this context. Um, One of the difficulties here is if we simply think about this idea of just donating food to foreign countries, we end up depressing prices in those local markets, and then we decrease farmer incomes in global markets. All right, so we do have a trade off there. Now, as we think about domestic food security, what's important in this respect is that the U.S. is heavily reliant on imports of fresh fruits and vegetables. Like, we just can't get around that. We do not have the climate nor the ecology to produce enough fruits and vegetables to satisfy domestic demand. And if there's anything of concern, particularly as you think about poor communities and urban communities, and what the USDA will often term food deserts, it's this idea that you can't get healthy and nutritious food to certain communities in the United States. And so the point is this: if we impose tariffs on imported fruits and vegetables, and we're mostly reliant on foreign countries in more tropical climate for fresh fruits and vegetables, we're essentially making fresh fruits and vegetables more expensive for US consumers. And if they're more expensive, people are going to consume less. Obviously, importers will import less because that's what tariffs do. and we don't have the domestic production capacity to replace lost export sales in this particular context. And so, the one thing, if we're going to improve food security, we really do need to think about making the importation of fruits and vegetables easier, not harder. I know that's controversial because in states like Florida, to a lesser degree, California, we do get a lot of fruit and vegetable production. We blueberry production even as far north as Michigan. Um, and these domestic producers do not like the competition they face from cheaper imports, and would even argue that there's some nefarious things going on in exporting countries leading to these imports being significantly cheaper. But while at the same time, if our efforts are to protect domestic producers in the fresh fruit and vegetable sectors, we really are making fresh fruits and vegetables more expensive for consumers here. And fresh fruits and vegetables are considered vital to the diets of the American consumer.
I want to shift gears just a little bit here and talk about research. What research tools or data sets are most critical in evaluating agricultural trade policy?
There are a couple of data sets. So I'll start with sort of free databases. One of the good things about the United States, as well as other well established industrialized countries, is that we do a good job of tracking both imports as well as exports at a very detailed product level, right? So not only do we, for example, track beef exports and beef imports, or chicken exports or chicken imports, we track it to the degree of, say, frozen leg quarters or frozen chicken paws or frozen cuts of beef with bone in. We really do sort of track very detailed products, even organic products. And so, for example, organic coffee in containers less than so many quarts of milliliters, right? So the point is that we actually have very good trade data sources. The Foreign Agricultural Service of USDA, the Economic Research Service of USDA have very good databases tracking international trade of agricultural products. The Department of Commerce through USA Trade Online has a much more detailed database beyond the agricultural sector. Now, if one is interested in global trade overall, not as detailed, but detailed all the same, the United Nations has what's called the United Nations Commodity Trade Database. The product categories are a little more broad than what you would get in sort of a national database like ours. And what it turns out that the entire world, for the most part, follows what's called a harmonized system. And the harmonized system of categorizing traded goods up to the quote unquote 6-digit level is pretty much what everybody uses. And so even countries in sub-Saharan Africa, developing countries, sort of track trade based on this harmonized system. So international trade data is far more reliable sometimes than even production and consumption data within the United States.
How do you see technology and innovation influencing agricultural trade and policy analysis?
All right, so it depends. If one is simply sort of thinking about innovation in the context of how we facilitate transactions, that clearly can improve transparency between companies and actually increase international business. So one thinks about, say, traceability issues in the animal product sector and how blockchain technology and artificial intelligence could actually lead to sort of improved animal traceability. So, for example, if there's a disease outbreak and or if there's a food pathogen outbreak in South Korea, how does that then all the way? So how is that then traced all the way back to not just the country of origin, but the actual farm from which a particular slaughtered cattle came from in the United States? So technology is real good in terms of helping us to understand traceability as we think about animal disease outbreaks and food pathogen outbreaks. The other thing that technology is important, and that is something we actually need in the United States is improvement in port infrastructure. Because how we get products in and out of ports is very important to how we get products in and out of the hands of businesses to consumers. And so I really do think sort of improvements in port technology, where the US actually lags behind some of the major ports globally, like in Singapore and in China. And the last thing I'll say, just in terms of technological advancement, is just in production issues. Um, and clearly that's going to improve overall as we think about sort of production beyond just primary agriculture, both in the food processing space as well as in sort of issues of packaging, issues of labeling, and then finally, most importantly, issues of certifying credit between countries and ensuring that the facilitation of sales can take place without any kind of financial blockages due to issues of how does one verify the validity of a buyer as well as the validity of sellers in exporting countries.
Where do you see the biggest risks and the biggest opportunities for U.S. agricultural exports, short term and long term?
That's a tough one. Obviously, the risk now relate to our reliance on certain markets. And so I do think the USDA has been quite good in sort of thinking about how do we diversify export sales, because clearly what's taken place over the last couple of years has been our heavy reliance on the Chinese market for export sales, and so that's always a risk when export sales are so reliant on destination markets, because once you get trade tensions or other issues, you tend to have heavy negative hits to export sales because of this reliance. And so that's the first part on the risk side. The other thing I do think on the opportunity side is in the diversification of export sales, really thinking about how do we position ourselves to gain a greater share of these emerging markets. And emerging markets ranging from increasing export sales to China and India, as well as just sort of trying to find inroads in sub-Saharan Africa.
With everything that's going on, Dr. Muhammad, in your position as Blasingame Chair, how does this increase your work? What efforts is the University of Tennessee, aiding in trying to help the farmers or contributing in terms of helping the farmers? Just what are you doing in your day-to-day in your position to help farmers during this crisis?
So one of the things that I do in my outreach position is I simply provide information. Information about tariffs, information about trade dynamics, information about the competition we face from foreign exporters in our major destination markets. But something else that I also do is I make an effort to educate, because I think one of the things that at least I realize is that there's a lot of misinformation as it relates to globalization and global dynamics affecting not just US agriculture, but the broader US economy. Let me give you two things. A big part of what's taking place now is a belief that US manufacturing is in decline and that it's been in decline for quite some time. And what a lot of people do not realize is that US manufacturing is at record levels. Now, mind you, in recent years, it's leveled off and it certainly declines during recessions and it recovers. But US manufacturing has simply shifted. It's not declined. It's become more automated, that robotics have replaced people. And a big part of what was once done in the Midwest has moved to other parts of the United States, most notably the US South. And so, because we've seen a loss in manufacturing jobs due to automation and robotics, it's automatically assumed that we've also had a decline in manufacturing. And we have not, which means these tariffs, in their effort to bring back manufacturing, we're actually talking about sort of a manufacturing sector that has never fully left, although we have seen declines in certain manufacturing sectors. Like clearly we have declines in, say, textiles and clothing manufacturing or leather goods manufacturing or paper manufacturing. But automobile manufacturing has actually increased, and a big part of that now takes place down south. So I do make an effort to sort of to educate the public on two things. That one, all of these policies are based on a misunderstanding of what's taking place in U.S. manufacturing. But then the other thing is that even if we bring back companies, right, and that does not necessarily mean we're bringing back jobs. And I'll give you an example. Black & Decker recently moved back to the United States, at least brought back a production facility. And according to this article, the same production line that it would have required, say, 60 people in Southeast Asia, only requires 12 people here because our wages are so high, it justifies the implementation of labor-saving technologies. So even if we bring factories back, we don't necessarily bring the jobs back. And then as technology improves, you're just going to get manufacturing job loss. And China, despite being the largest manufacturing country in the world, has experienced manufacturing job loss as well. The other thing I think is a misunderstanding that I often try to educate the public on is that we need to understand sort of what does it mean to have a trade deficit, and particularly even bilateral trade deficits. The president seems heavily focused on goods trade, right? More so than services trade, where we actually have a surplus, as well as trade in assets. And what a lot of people do not understand is that goods and services trade are often reconciled through asset trade. And the two of those things must always balance. And one of the assets that we trade is we actually sell US securities to the world, which is government debt, right? So the world helps to finance government debt. And to the degree that we sell those assets to the world, they must be offset by trade deficits. It's an accounting issue, actually, that must always be the case. And so the point I also try to educate folks on is that you don't solve trade deficit problems with tariffs necessarily. And so I do sort of start with trying to educate that there's both a misunderstanding of what's taking place with manufacturing, as well as a misunderstanding of how does one attack trade deficits, in that can tariffs get us there? It can only get us there at significant cost to both imports and exports. And one could have a trade deficit of zero if I buy nothing from you and you buy nothing from me, right? Because 0 minus 0 is 0. But that does not necessarily mean we're better off as a consequence of having a zero trade balance with a foreign country.
If you could give one piece of advice to policymakers right now, what would it be?
The one thing I would say is that we need much more permanence in trade policy. I'll give you an idea, like just sort of to put this in perspective. So the U.S. Trade Policy Uncertainty Index is usually around 200, maybe 300. Sometimes it's less than 200. During President Trump's previous term, I think that got as high as about 1,800. All right, so uncertainty being, say, 6 times, 7 times as much. As of late, within the last, since 2025, January, it's been as high as about 8,000. Right? I think policymakers need to understand this, and that is we need to implement policies within a certain regulatory and rule-based framework. That rules are a good thing in this respect, that you can't be in control of the policy levers as well as in control of the rules all at the same time. It just creates too much uncertainty. And so one could think that if we have these policy levers, then we need to be okay with broader globalization rules on how these policy levers get implemented. because they add a certain certainty to the business environment, and companies need certainty to engage in global business. And so if there was any advice to policymakers, I would say that we really do need to understand that this sort of on again, off again type tariff type policies may do more harm than good, despite our well intentions. And then the other thing I would say policymakers should understand, which is a very hard thing to get any people to like, it's a hard thing to get most to understand, is if we want to solve the so-called trade deficit problem, then we need to solve the government spending problem. And if we don't want to solve the government spending problem, then we're sort of swimming against the stream in our efforts to solve the so-called trade deficit problem.
This has been a very informative, Dr. Muhammad. Are there any final thoughts or words that you'd like to leave for our viewing audience?
Yeah, the one thing I'll say to the viewing audience is this. I know it's pretty easy to be hard on the other side politically. And I make an effort to be objective, both in my critique as well as support. And so right now, I do find it interesting, all right, that the political left and the political right have pretty much changed sides as it relates to trade policy. Regardless of your political leanings, here's something to note, that the tariffs that President Trump imposed back in 2018 and 19 remained in place the entire time under the President Biden rather. And he actually even increased tariffs. All right. And so the point is, this is not a unique thing to a particular president or party. We're just sort of in this populist era where people are thinking much more internally than in terms of growing the global pie. And so I would sort of admonish both Democrats as well as Republicans to once again think about the fact that when the world is better off, we're better off. And although we've experienced some declines through what some economists would call hyperglobalization, a more managed globalization is far better than cutting us off or being cut off from the global market overall. And like I said, I find this is not just a critique of the Trump administration. This is a critique of quite a few administrations, both on the political left and right, that have sort of seen protectionism as beneficial, when in fact it often leads to more harm than good.
Well, we thank you for being a guest on the Policy Center Live, Dr. Muhammad.
Oh, thank you for having me.
To learn more about what the Policy Center does, like us on our social media platforms on Linktree/National Policy Research Center. We hope you tune in for future episodes of the Policy Center Live. We'll see you next time.